nice to have just a bit of an overview into the North Devon Biosphere Reserve and this overall programme and some of the things we're going to be looking at. Well, as I said, thank you for coming along today. Really, this is our way of showing some of the things we've been doing under the TRIP project and looking at some of the information we've been gathering. You'll hear today about why we're working on this catchment, why we're working on the river, some of the problems that are there. You'll also hear some of the statutory monitoring that's going on that allows us to inform sort of the local people, but also regional and national and international in terms of the European directives we have to meet, what the status of this river is. But we'll also start picking out the information you need to actually make decisions on the ground and manage this catchment and play around with what you do, where you do it and why you do it. And that data is going to be really important because of the fact that it's how we convince people to act, how we convince a farmer to do something, or the water company to do something, or a private owner with a septic tank to do something. The more information we have, the more we can define the responsibilities, define where people are legally required to do things. So I just wanted to set that scene for you today, and then we'll see how how those stories pan out during the day, and some of that information. And then this afternoon, as we said, hopefully, if the weather's good, we'll go down and have a look at we'll go and have a look at something that isn't there, which is effectively a weir we removed. I've got some video footage of us removing it, and we'll talk about why that happened at the end of the session. And so hopefully we'll go down there. If we can't go down there, we'll bring up some invertebrates and we'll do a few things up here, and it's a chance to chat and talk to each other afterwards. Anyway, so the Taw River Improvement Project, that's what TRIP stands for. It's a catchment restoration funded project. Jerry Gallop, sitting in the corner, is the guy who manages that fund. So there's lots of these projects going across the country, all of them aimed at delivering improvements in Water Framework Directive, water quality, good ecological status. Okay, so that's the driver. Now we can look at the pressures on our catchments and we can see that there are lots of things. There's private sewerage, there's sewerage coming from the water companies. We've got things like barriers in the river which can affect migration of species. There's certainly not, by all means, not all the pressures. We've got a lot of agricultural pressures in this catchment. A very large percentage is agricultural. And is managed agriculturally, and so there's various pressures, whether it be land-based through poaching or tracking, or nutrients pollutants being put on the nutrients and pesticides being put on the land, which is what the farmer wants, but he doesn't want them in the river, and we don't want them in the river. He wants them in the plant. Now this causes various impacts on our river. If we have too much phosphate in the river, we can lead to eutrophication, which is algae building up, which can then die off and strips out some of the oxygen in the river, which causes our river to fail. It can, in extreme events, cause things like fish kills, as can things like toxins in the water. So again, those are some issues. We know we have, if the way the land is managed, the way the water interacts with the land and runs off, we know that can affect things like flooding in the area. And then when that goes down through the river into the estuary, there's also knock-on issues if we have to dredge for navigation. All of that in there is effectively topsoil. Topsoil is incredibly expensive to buy in, yet a lot of it's just wandering down the river and then ending up in the estuaries. So there's this interesting issue about how we manage land, what are the implications, what are the pressures, and what are the impacts on the river, but importantly on us as well. If I asked you to put your hands up if you care about getting to good ecological status and meeting Water Framework Directive demands, you'd probably say maybe. If I said, do you care about being sick when you go into the river, or when you do you care about having good clean drinking water? Do you care about having being able to see some of the species, some of the animals not being flooded? Those are the things people care about. So. But this is about WFD, this is about the Water Framework Directive and some of those issues. Now the TAW fails predominantly for two reasons. It fails for fish failures, which is where you go out and assess how many fish are in a river, whether that's what you expect to have in a river. And in these catchments shaded in blue, these are areas where actually there's less fish than we would expect to see in the river. And that can be for various reasons. It could be that we have sediment running off of the land, which covers spawning habitat and smothers habitat, so the fish can't actually breed. Or there's other things like migration barriers, especially for obviously migratory fish, where they come up to a barrier like this and actually they can't get up and over it. And so you might have lots of fish below, but very few fish above. Now, all the black dots are the obstructions, the weirs, historic weirs. A lot of them are no longer operational, some of them still are, but we can do things about that once we know where they are and we know what the implications for how much they're stopping fish from accessing. So we can have a look at those. The other thing that fails is it fails for phosphate. So you go out and check the phosphate in the rivers and have a look at that. And really the phosphate comes from a multitude of sources. If there's something called the Reasons for Failure database, which is an Environment Agency database that starts suggesting where some of these pressures could come from. And it's for most of these catchments in the red hatching where it's failing for phosphate. It's a mixture of all sorts of domestic, so whether it's private septic tanks, sewage treatment works, agricultural, even forestry within there. All the green dots are sewage treatment works within there. Interestingly, we've overlaid here the red to blue map behind it is cattle density. So again, that tells us something about how many, sort of the intensity of cattle operations in there, which can be a significant source of phosphate, both through them defecating into the river, and urinating into the river, but also losing things like sediment with phosphate bound to it, and things like all the septic slurry pits, and those sorts of features, which can present problems. Like this cow in the river there, always a nice picture caught in the act. So effectively, we need to address these issues, and there are three tools we can do that. We've got regulation. There's a lot of legal regulation out there which we can enforce, whether it be cross-compliance, nitrate vulnerable zones, the statutory management requirements that say what farmers, certainly on the agricultural side, what they can and can't do. The difficulty for that is you need to have people on the ground. You need to be able to pick up those issues. You need to be able to see them. So if you don't see them, you can't enforce on them. But that's definitely a polluter pays principle. That's where we're saying, no, you can't do this, and so we're going to enforce you to make sure it doesn't happen, and regulate you to make sure it doesn't happen. Then on top of that, you can have win-wins. We spent a lot of time, the trust is almost 20 years old now, and for most of that we've worked with farmers to not tell them that they should be doing stuff because of the fact that it improves the river, but they should be doing stuff because of the fact that it saves them money. So if we give them advice on dirty clean water separation, where the roof water, the clean roof water goes to the field or goes to the river, but the dirty water goes to the slurry pit, actually they're saving money, because any clean water that ends up in their slurry pit, they have to spread at £1.50 a cubic metre. That's a considerable cost when you consider a 20 by 30 metre barn will have 600 square metres, and then when you add on 1.5 metres of rainfall, that's 900 cubic metres of rain every year that they have to spread and cost. So there's some significant savings we can make with farmers out there. So that's the provider saves. That's good advice given in the right way, so they pick that up. And then finally, the other one is incentivisation. If we want someone to do something and we're not paying them to do it, they're not saving money to do it, and it's not a legal requirement to do it, we can look at paying them to do it. And that's something called incentivisation. There's things like environmental stewardship, the CSF officers, catchment sensitive farming will give out grants. We have our own sort of scheme called Paid Ecosystem Services, which is we're trying to work with some of the beneficiaries. People like the water company benefits if we can improve raw water quality upstream of where they're abstracting, so we can start playing around with that. So to ultimately, that's why we set up the Taw River Improvement Project. It's split into survey and monitoring, fisheries management, agricultural management and biodiversity management. And the thing that we're really here to talk about is the surveying and monitoring side of it that gives us the evidence we need to start changing management. Ultimately, the water bodies in orange are where we're working, because those are the ones that are currently failing for phosphate and fish in there, and then the different codings up here are just how we work with the partners to ensure when the same person is not going onto the same farm over and over again. So effectively we have our paid partners, as it were, in the project, our Sylvanus Trust, Devon Wildlife Trust, FWAG and ourselves, but then there's a whole myriad of other partners and a broader partnership that sits on the advisory group. just to disseminate what's happening, pick up any issues, try and integrate with some of the other groups on the ground. And ultimately, just finishing off, these are some of the things we're trying to do out there, especially on the agricultural side. There's some sort of the domestic side as well, but on the agricultural side, this is what we often find on the left-hand side, inappropriate infrastructure, inappropriate management, all of that leading to the pressure, the sediment, the nutrients, getting into the river, causing those that degradation in quality and causing those failures. So what we're trying to do is get to a situation on the right through both regulation, the win-win advice, and also that incentivisation. So you can see here where regulation might force you to make sure that you're leaving the appropriate buffers around the river. Incentivisation might make it viable to do a lot of the yard work, where if without a grant, it might be a 40-year payback period, and the bank won't let sort of the farmer invest necessarily in that. Or maybe where actually it's not in the farmer's interest at all, but we want to buy up margins of land, which gives you an ecological corridor. Actually, we might be paying 100% for that sort of intervention, that sort of thing. So those are some of the things which we're looking at. There's a very whistle-stop tour of just putting today in context, but I want to sort of hand over now and chair this session on the research behind it and some of the monitoring that's going on. Are there any, just before I move on to the next speaker, are there any questions about TRIP as a project, or about sort of what we're doing here today?